There are moments when a system doesn't announce danger with sirens or ultimatums. It does something much quieter. It produces movement without explanation, activity without attribution. Events that look ordinary when taken one by one, and deeply wrong when you hesitate long enough to see them together. What has been unfolding lately fits exactly into that category. Nothing officially declared, nothing formally acknowledged, and yet the pressure has begun to rise, almost mechanically, as if the machinery itself is warming up before anyone dares to name what comes next. It starts with unusual motion, air activity, where none was expected, military routines that suddenly lose their routine character, the kind of maneuvers that are described as precautionary, but carried out with a level of urgency that doesn't match the language used to explain them. At the same time, across several distant locations, infrastructure fails in ways that are quickly labeled accidental. Isolated incidents, we're told, coincidences, technical faults, but coincidences have a habit of becoming patterns the moment someone stops rushing past them. Then there are the statements, carefully phrased, delivered with restraint, warnings framed as deterrence, deterrence framed as responsibility. The kind of sentences that don't sound like threats unless you already understand the consequences they imply. When officials say that miscalculation would carry unbearable costs, they usually don't elaborate. They don't need to. That silence is part of the message. And it arrives precisely when military deployments begin to thicken. Not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to be noticed by those who track these things for a living. At ground level, the picture becomes more unsettling. Explosions occur in separate cities, hours apart, hundreds of kilometers between them. Residential structures, commercial zones, upper floors collapsing into lower ones. Casualties that don't fit the scale of industrial accidents, and damage that doesn't behave like random failure. Authorities move quickly to explain, too quickly. The explanations are simple, almost dismissive, as if complexity itself would invite the wrong kind of attention. Gas leaks, structural issues, unfortunate timing, and yet the timing is exactly what refuses to be ignored. These incidents do not happen in isolation from the political environment surrounding them. They occur against a background of internal unrest that has recently been suppressed with extraordinary force. A society still vibrating from trauma does not absorb shocks the way a stable one does. Every unexplained blast carries weight far beyond its physical radius. Rumors move faster than official statements, and silence becomes a breeding ground for conclusions the system is no longer fully able to control. What makes this more uncomfortable is what happens next. Instead of de-escalation, we see preparation. Exercises announced abruptly. Live fire drills scheduled in locations that happen to sit at the heart of global energy flows. Ports that are not just ports, but choke points. Bases that are not just bases, but symbols of reach. These are not interchangeable places. They are chosen. And choice implies intent, even when intent is denied. At the same time, external actors issue denials with unusual speed. Not involved, no role played, no connection. Such statements are meant to calm markets and publics, but they also signal something else, that everyone understands how close the situation is to being interpreted as something much larger. When multiple players rush to distance themselves from events before being accused, it suggests that the threshold for accusation itself has become dangerously low. Behind the scenes, diplomatic language hardens while pretending to soften. Accusations are framed as concern. Pressure is described as assistance. Economic strain is blamed on outsiders, while the internal consequences are treated as unavoidable. This rhetorical balancing act usually appears when leadership senses that control over the narrative is slipping, even if control over territory and force remains intact. And this is where the unease deepens. Because the incidents are no longer just about damage or casualties. They intersect with schedules, with exercises planned days in advance, with deployments already underway, with warnings issued just early enough to look precautionary and just late enough to feel reactive. The pieces begin to align in a way that feels procedural rather than conspiratorial. No single dramatic decision, just a sequence of steps that, once taken, become difficult to reverse. It still looks manageable. It still fits within familiar frameworks: deterrence, signaling, posturing. But those frameworks depend on predictability, and predictability is exactly what starts to erode when explanations stop matching observable reality. When too many events require the public to accept coincidence as a governing principle, confidence quietly drains away. And that is usually the point where the most important questions begin to surface, unasked and unanswered. Were these incidents meant to send a message, or are they symptoms of something already slipping out of alignment? Is the visible military activity a response to instability or an attempt to contain it before it becomes visible to everyone else? And at what moment does a system stop managing escalation and start being carried along by it? Because what appears chaotic on the surface begins to look disturbingly structured once you examine how the system reacts, not emotionally, but procedurally. This is not about a sudden decision or a dramatic shift in doctrine. It is about mechanisms that were already in place, quietly moving from standby to execution mode. The first mechanism is narrative compression. When multiple incidents occur across different locations, the system's instinct is not to explain each one in detail, but to flatten them into a single, simplified cause. Accidents, infrastructure failures, domestic issues. This is not incompetence, it is risk management. Detailed explanations invite questions. Questions create timelines. Timelines expose coordination. And coordination is precisely what must be avoided in public perception. The more complex the reality, the more aggressively simplicity is enforced. The second mechanism is force signaling without commitment. Military assets are repositioned, exercises announced, readiness levels adjusted, but always framed as routine. Nothing is officially escalatory, yet these moves are visible enough to be registered by adversaries and allies alike. This creates a dual message. Externally, capability is being demonstrated. Internally, leadership avoids crossing a rhetorical line that would demand accountability or formal authorization. It's a way of advancing position while preserving deniability. This is where the system usually believes it is being clever. It assumes that ambiguity buys time, but ambiguity also generates its own pressure. Once assets are deployed, they must be justified. Once exercises are scheduled, they must be completed. Once warnings are issued, they must be credible. The system becomes trapped by its own signaling, forced to maintain a posture that grows heavier with each additional move. A third mechanism begins to surface beneath the military layer: strategic geography. The locations involved are not incidental. They sit along energy corridors, maritime choke points, logistical hubs that underpin not just regional stability, but global markets. When activity concentrates in these areas, it introduces a different kind of leverage, not direct confrontation, but systemic vulnerability. Even the suggestion of disruption is enough to ripple through insurance rates, shipping schedules, and political calculations far beyond the immediate region. At this stage, allies start behaving differently, not publicly, but tactically. Warnings are issued quietly. Assessments are shared behind closed doors. The language shifts from confidence to contingency. Defense planners stop asking whether a conflict will happen and begin asking what survives if it does. This is a critical transition point. Once allies move into contingency mode, the diplomatic space narrows dramatically because everyone starts preparing for outcomes they are still publicly denying. Internally, another pressure builds. Recent unrest, even if suppressed, leaves institutional scars. Security services become hyper-vigilant. Intelligence thresholds lower. Every anomaly starts to look like a precursor. This creates an environment where overreaction becomes more likely, not less. The system is no longer calibrating responses based on long-term stability, but on immediate control. And control, once prioritized, tends to justify actions that would previously have been considered too risky. What's especially dangerous here is that none of these mechanisms require malicious intent. They operate automatically once certain conditions are met. Information suppression, force signaling, geographic leverage, allied contingency planning, internal security paranoia. Each makes sense in isolation. Together, they form a feedback loop. And feedback loops don't need orders to accelerate. At this point, the situation is no longer defined by who wants war and who wants peace. That distinction becomes almost irrelevant. The real question shifts to whether the system still has enough flexibility to absorb another shock without responding in a way it can't walk back. History suggests that this is usually where flexibility begins to fail. Because when enough preparations are in motion, restraint starts to look like weakness, even to those who value it. And when restraint is reinterpreted as vulnerability, the logic of escalation stops being debated and starts being assumed. And this is where the structure tightens further, because the next step is rarely announced. It doesn't come with a declaration or a red line. It comes as a response that feels necessary at the time, a response that, once taken, quietly changes the rules of what comes after. The consequences begin not with impact, but with commitment. Once systems shift from signaling to readiness, every option narrows. Assets positioned forward cannot simply drift back without meaning. Exercises completed cannot be unseen. Warnings issued cannot be withdrawn without cost. At this stage, the environment changes its character. Decisions stop being about intention and start being about momentum. What this means in practice is brutally simple. Any additional incident, no matter how limited, is no longer evaluated on its own terms. It is filtered through everything that has already been set in motion. A localized explosion is no longer just an internal matter. A missile test is no longer just a test. A naval maneuver is no longer just a maneuver. Each action is interpreted as confirmation of the worst assumption already circulating inside planning rooms. This is where miscalculation becomes structurally likely, not because actors are irrational, but because the margin for interpretation collapses. When systems prepare for escalation, they also prepare narratives that justify it. Response options are pre-written. Thresholds are lowered quietly. What once required proof now requires only plausibility. And plausibility in this environment is abundant. The economic layer begins to react even before the military one does. Insurance premiums rise, shipping routes adjust, energy markets price in disruption that has not yet occurred. These reactions feed back into political pressure, creating urgency where patience might otherwise have prevailed. Leaders start receiving reports not about hypothetical risks, but about real costs accumulating by the hour. The argument shifts from whether escalation is necessary to whether delay is still affordable. At the same time, internal security dynamics harden further. Surveillance expands, counterintelligence grows more aggressive, loyalty tests become stricter. In such conditions, dissent is not just unwelcome, it is reclassified as a vulnerability. Information flow tightens, and with it, the ability of leadership to receive corrective signals. The system begins to hear mostly what confirms its existing trajectory. Externally, allies hedge. Public support becomes conditional. Private assurances grow cautious. No one wants to be the last actor fully committed when the situation turns irreversible. This creates a paradox. Collective restraint weakens precisely when collective action would be most stabilizing. Each player waits for another to absorb the risk of de-escalation first. At this point, the concept of control becomes deceptive. Everything appears organized. Commands are clear, forces are disciplined, plans are detailed, and yet the outcome is increasingly shaped by automatic responses rather than deliberate choice. The system is no longer steering, it is balancing, constantly correcting for instability it helped create. This is usually the moment historians identify later, when they note that alternatives still existed, but were no longer politically survivable. Not because they were impossible, but because they required reversing too many visible commitments at once. Backing down would have demanded an explanation stronger than the escalation itself. Nothing has fully broken yet. No definitive line has been crossed. But the architecture of restraint is visibly thinning. What remains is a structure capable of absorbing only a limited number of shocks before it defaults to force as the simplest remaining answer. And the most unsettling part is not that this path leads somewhere dramatic, it's that it doesn't need to. The system now only requires one more ordinary event, interpreted under extraordinary conditions, to move past a point where intention no longer matters at all.